Hello, and welcome to Critical Thinking and COVID-19, Episode 3, The Argument from Authority. Now, there are many sources of information about the pandemic, and not all of them are good or reliable, but accurate information is critical to your well-being and even to your survival. Unfortunately, the challenge is to sort out between the good sources and the bad ones. Some sources do mean well, but are unintentionally spreading misinformation. Other sources have malicious intent and are spreading disinformation. While being an expert on these matters is the best way to sort them out, in terms of who to trust, most of us are not experts in these areas. But we are not helpless. While we cannot become medical experts overnight, even through Facebook or Dr. Google, we can learn the basic skills for assessing sources and gain the ability to critically evaluate those who claim to have the truth. Now, when you accept a claim from a source because the source is supposed to be an authority or expert, you're using what people in philosophy, what we call an argument from authority. Now, despite the usefulness of this argument, and they are very useful, it is relatively weak. You don't have direct evidence for the claim, but you're believing it because the source is credible. The gist of the reasoning is this. You're accepting a claim is probably true because the source probably knows the truth and is probably telling the truth. So there's a lot of probablys in there. Despite the inherent weakness in this argument type, a true expert is more likely to be right than wrong when making considered claims within their area of expertise. So while this argument is usually presented informally, it does have a logical structure, broken down in terms of premises, which are reasons or evidence for a claim, and of course the conclusion, the point that the argument is supposed to support. So formally speaking, the first premise would be that A, the authority in question, is supposed to be an authority on a subject, subject S. Premise 2, person A makes claim C about subject S, conclusion, therefore the claim is true. Or put, kind of informally, this person's an authority on the subject, they make the claim in the subject, so it's true. To give an example more concretely, suppose that you believe that you should not shake hands with people because Dr. Fauci says you should not, and you trust his expertise in this matter. That would be an example of informal argument from authority. You're essentially saying, yep, that claim's true, because Dr. Fauci knows what he's talking about when it comes to infectious disease. But how do you know when an authority is really an expert? Fortunately, there are clear standards that can be applied, even if you know little or nothing about the claim being made. So you're not directly assessing the claim, you're looking at the quality of the source. Now, to the degree that an argument meets these standards, then it is reasonable to accept the conclusion is probably true. If the argument doesn't meet the standards, it would, this may seem kind of odd, but actually be a fallacy, a mistake in logic, to simply infer the claim must be false. Because even if an argument from authority is bad, it doesn't prove the claim is not true. It just means if the authority is not a good one, you shouldn't believe it on that basis, but not that you should reject it. And there's a difference, speaking a bit formally, between not accepting something and rejecting it, although it often seems the same. But to not accept something means you're suspending judgment. You don't know if it's true or false, but to reject it is to say it is false. So what are the standards? What do you use to assess an authority? First and most obviously, the person must have sufficient expertise in the subject. A person's expertise is determined by their relevant education, formal or otherwise, their relevant experience, their relevant accomplishments, their reputation, and position. Now, these should be carefully assessed to consider how much they establish expertise. For example, a person might occupy a very impressive position that would seem to make them credible as an expert, but they might only be there because of family connections, rather than any ability or knowledge. So, good to be careful. Now, the degree of expertise required varies from claim to claim. There's not like an absolute standard expertise where, for any claim in the universe, you've got to meet that standard or you're not an expert. It varies and comes in degrees. For example, someone who's completed a college biology course, a few of them successfully from a competent institution, could be considered an expert when they make a very basic claim like, that a virus replicates in living creatures by hijacking the cell mechanisms. And because being able to be an expert on something so basic just requires, some basic knowledge, basic education. But a few college classes in biology would not make a person an expert in epidemiology. So there are degrees. So essentially, the more difficult, complex the claim is, the more requirements are in place to be an expert in that. To give an example, Dr. Fauci, to use the obvious example, he's an example of an expert on the pandemic. He's got the education, he's got the experience, the accomplishments, solid reputation, the position. So what he says about the pandemic is very likely to be true. Second standard, the claim must be in a person's area of expertise. Expertise in one area doesn't automatically give a person expert in some other area, even a close one. And even within like a single field, a person could be an expert in one thing in that field, but not other things. And to use an example, take medicine. A person who completes their medical degree and they're an MD, they know medicine. But as you probably know, some people specialized in like orthopedic surgery. Some specialize in the nose and throat. Some specialize in feet or other stuff. And so while a medical doctor could say competent things about medicine, if you were concerned about, say, cancer, you'd talk to an oncologist. And so it especially holds in cases where someone is an expert in one area and that does not give them clearly expertise in things way out of their field. So a person could be, say, a great medical doctor, but they thus would not be qualified to talk about, say, artificial intelligence. Now, a person could have multiple areas. You could have someone who's like an expert in medicine, they got a law degree, etc., and they are a Renaissance person with many areas of expertise. But being an expert in one area doesn't automatically qualify a person in others. Unfortunately, this is often overlooked or even intentionally ignored. Celebrities, for example, actors, musicians, etc., are often seemingly accepted as experts because they put them on, the news and so forth, and ask them their views on various complicated subjects like politics and so on. But if they're just actors and musicians, they're not experts in those fields, unless of course they happen to be like someone who's got, they're an actor who also has, say, a PhD in political science or an MD, which there are some. But just because someone's a famous celebrity actor doesn't make them an expert outside of their field, obviously enough. Also, for example, billionaires are often wrongly regarded as experts in fields way outside their lanes, talking to them about things that are not in their field. Just because someone can make billions of dollars doing one thing doesn't make them qualified to talk about things outside of their field, doesn't make them an expert on other stuff. So, for example, Bill Gates has made a lot of money in computer stuff, and he's talking about pandemics and so on. Doesn't mean he's wrong, but getting medical advice from Bill Gates, despite the fact that he's a billionaire, would not be great. I'm not saying he would give you wrong or bad advice. It's just that he's not a medical doctor. Now, again, this doesn't mean that someone's claims are false because they're talking outside of their field. So if Bill Gates says, hey, yeah, you really shouldn't be shaking people's hands and you wash stuff down, doesn't mean he's wrong, just because he's not an expert in medicine. It just means if someone's speaking outside their field, they lack the expertise to give you a good reason to accept their claim based on their expertise, because they haven't got that. Now, Dr. Fauci is an excellent example of someone who is working in their field. So you can trust him. Third, there needs to be an adequate degree of agreement among the other experts in the field. If there's not this agreement, it would be a fallacy to simply appeal to a disputing expert that you happen to like. Why? Well, because if you have a claim made by one expert and there's no agreement in the field, there'll be a counterclaim by another equally credible, qualified expert. And if you're not an expert yourself, you don't know which expert to pick. So if one says one thing, one says another, and the field is split, say, like 50-50, you have no way of deciding which experts have got it right, unless you're an expert yourself, in which case you wouldn't have to appeal to them. Now, how much agreement is required? Is there an exact number that you must look at and say, aha, it hits that number, I can trust them, or, oop, it misses it by 0.001, I cannot? Well, essentially, no exact number. But the gist is this. The majority view of the qualified experts is the rational thing to believe at that time. Well, they could turn out to be wrong, because experts aren't infallible. In general, the majority consensus of experts is going to be correct, as opposed to, the minority of qualified experts. Again, not guaranteed. So what often happens, though, is that people who really feel strongly about a matter will go with the expert they feel is right, because they feel strongly about it, and reject the majority of experts. Now, the dissenting, tiny number of experts could be right. But if you're not an expert, you have no way of knowing that they are correct. And if a person just, says, I really like this view because of my politics or ideology, so that one expert's going to be right, well, what reason, logically speaking, does that give? If I just say, yep, I'm believing that one person, even though I have no expert myself, I just like them. And that would be bad logic. Again, the dissenter could turn out to be right. And people always like to bring up, these famous dissenters that turn out to be right, neglecting the dissenters no one knows about because they were totally wrong. So in general, the majority of experts are generally right. Not always, but generally. So if you don't know yourself, the majority opinion of the qualified experts is the rational choice. Now, in the case of the current pandemic, the majority of medical experts are in general agreement about the facts of the matter. Although, of course, not 100% agreement about 100% of the things, there are still disagreements. Which is why you should listen to the medical experts and not non-experts. Fourth, there is a matter of bias. An expert, to be credible, must not be significantly biased. Examples of biasing factors would include the person standing to gain financially from their claim being accepted, or a person's political ideology, that the claim matches up with their worldview, how they see things, what politicians they like, or what do they embrace communism or fascism or laissez-faire economics. Also qualities like sexism, racism, all things that can bias people. Now, to the degree that someone is biased, their credibility is reduced. While everyone does have biases, this becomes a concern when the bias is likely to unduly influence the person. It can actually sensibly impact them. For example, suppose you have a doctor who owns a company that produces an antiviral medication. They could be biased about making claims about the efficacy of that medication on COVID-19 because they stand to make money from it. Now, bias does need to be carefully judged, and to reject a person's claim because you suspect bias, or even if they are biased, can be a fallacy. A person could be biased but resist it, and even a biased person could be right. Going back to the antiviral example, suppose a doctor says, we've got this antiviral medication, it works, we've tested it, and someone says, they're just in it to make money, it can't work. Well, that would be what's called an ad hominem fallacy, saying they must be wrong because of something about them that's not liked. So, While unbiased experts can still be wrong, because again, experts are not infallible, an unbiased expert is more credible than a biased expert, all other factors being equal. And again, going to the running example I'm using of a good expert, Dr. Fauci. He only seems biased in favor of keeping us, the rest of us, healthy and alive. So doesn't seem to be gaining any money, doesn't seem to have any like ideological, motivations, and so does not seem significantly biased, hence credible. Fifth, the area of expertise must be a legitimate area or discipline. While there can be debate about what counts as a legitimate area, there are clear-cut cases. For example, if someone claims to be an expert in, magical or non-magical healing crystals and recommends using quartz to ward off COVID-19, which, by the way, does not work. There's no reason to think that would do anything. Then it'd be unwise to accept their claim. Why? Because magic healing crystals is not a legitimate area. Now, using Dr. Fauci as a positive example, clearly, medical fields are clearly legitimate. So in the area of legitimate fields and discipline, thing to do, of course, in the case of the pandemic is watch out for people, maybe with the best of intentions. They may truly believe in the power of crystals or the power of, positive thinking or the power of, something that has no basis in science. So in cases where the legitimacy of the area has not been established, again, you can't conclude they're with absolute certainty wrong, but definitely not the time to be putting faith in things that are utterly unproven and unestablished. 6. The authority must be identified. If a person says a claim is true because an anonymous expert or alleged expert makes a claim, you have no way to tell if that is really an expert. This doesn't make the claim false, though. If you say, aha, that person said they say, you should wash your hands, but they didn't identify the expert, so they're wrong, well, again, that would be a fallacy, too. It's what's called the fallacy, where it's assumed that if someone commits a fallacy, therefore, they're just wrong. Now, but if you don't have the ability to assess the unnamed expert, because you don't know who they are, you have no way of knowing if they're credible. Are they credible? Are they not? You don't know, because you don't know who they are. They are a mystery expert. In such cases, you shouldn't just reject the claim. Again, that would be a mistake. You should probably suspend judgment and say, well, the alleged expert says this, no expert given, no idea who it is. I can't infer that it must be false, because that would be a fallacy. I certainly can't say that it's true, because I don't know who they are, so suspend judgment. Now, of course, you can obviously refer to other sources of information, but in terms of that's all you've got, someone says, oh, they say this, then you'd have to say, I don't know who they are, no way of knowing. So, it's important that you be able to identify the alleged authority. Now, as would be expected, unnamed experts are often used on social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So it's always wise to be wary of unnamed experts, but especially on such platforms, because they are vehicles of disinformation and misinformation. Finally, an expert needs to be honest and trustworthy. While being honest means that a person is saying what they think is true, it doesn't follow that they must be correct. A person could be honest and say things that are actually untrue. Despite this, an honest expert is obviously more credible than a source that is inclined to dishonesty, to mostly saying false things. However, to infer that a dishonest source must be wrong about a particular claim would also be an error. A person could be generally dishonest, prone to lying, getting things wrong constantly, but you can't infer that because of those tendencies towards lying and being wrong, that a particular claim must be false. That doesn't follow. So, for example, if someone is a terrible liar, and wrong about stuff, then you say, aha, they say 2 + 2 is 4, they're wrong. Well, clearly that would be mistaken. So, inferring that a dishonest source must be wrong would be a mistake, Inferring that an honest source must be correct would be a mistake, but in general, as we've noted, an honest source is more credible than a dishonest source. Turning to our example, Dr. Fauci enjoys an honest reputation for exceptional honesty, so plus in his favor. Now, while these standards have been presented in terms of assessing individuals, the same standards do apply to institutions and groups. For example, looking at the CDC, you'd apply those standards, the institution as a whole, and you'd find out, they're pretty credible. Now, in terms of who to trust during the pandemic, the clear experts that can be trusted given these standards would be obviously Dr. Fauci. The CDC is generally pretty trustworthy, although one concern is, of course, it's influenced by the government, which does have the potential for bias there. So political considerations could overcome medical considerations. Going back to our point about bias, a thing to watch for. But in general, the CDC, when it's presenting clear medical claims, unbiased and influenced by other sources or other influencing factors, would be credible. The World Health Organization, also generally credible. Again, it's a political organization, so you need to watch for potential influences there, but in general would be very, very credible. Now, this is not to say you should be uncritical in the claims they make, as I just noted, but they are good, reliable sources. Now, as far as other sources, there are some that are quite good. Again, medical experts, would, if you can establish their expertise, would be credible sources. But there are, of course, sources that are not only sort of wrong, there are some that are actively dangerous to believe. And using these standards and applying them objectively can help you sort out which sources you should regard as credible. And again, when in doubt, the thing to do is suspend judgment. If you're not sure, well, you can't be sure. So, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.